inauguré en 2019 grâce à l'appui de la Banque nationale du Canada, l'Observatoire des conflits multidimensionnels, ou l'OCM, comme on l'appelle chez nous, a pour but d'étudier les nouvelles stratégies de puissance que divers acteurs déploient dans le monde pour déstabiliser des États, fragiliser leurs institutions et processus politiques ou porter atteinte à leurs systèmes et infrastructures critiques. Donc, on étudie la désinformation, les cyberattaques, l'ingérence électorale, l'espionnage économique, mais aussi la géoéconomie. Et la table ronde d'aujourd'hui porte d'ailleurs sur la géoéconomie. Elle s'intitule The U.S. China-Canada Dance, Geoeconomics and Power Politics After Trump. Today's roundtable will be in English, as two of our three experts do most of their work in this language. I'll introduce them in a moment, but first let me say a few words about the theme of the webinar. When the Cold War ended in the early 90s, political scientists like Edward Luttwak predicted that international relations were on the verge of a crucial transition from geopolitics to geoeconomics. According to such theories, global trade rivalries would take precedence over military rivalries, and states would use various tools to engage in this competition, like import restrictions in the form of tariffs, export subsidies, and so on. Such measures would aim to maximize the economic power of states by offering the best jobs to the greatest number of individuals in the societies concerned. Luttwak later argued that the states engage in geoeconomic competition to gain or preserve desirable roles in the global economy, a dynamic he describes as follows in his writings, quote, "Who will develop the next generation of jet airliners, computers, biotechnology products, advanced materials, financial services, and all other high-value output in industries large and small? Will the designers, technologists, managers, financiers of the world be in the United States, in China, or in other countries like Canada?" Other scholars have defined contemporary geoeconomic dynamics after that. Robert Blackwell and Jennifer Harris wrote a book in 2016 in which they show that states use various economic instruments to promote and defend the national interest. You might also be familiar with another book published in 2019 by Michael Wiggle, Soren Scholvin, and Micah Altola, where the authors write that economic offensives have never been more central to foreign policy. And this seems to be particularly the case when one looks at the three-way relationship between China, Canada, and the United States. In recent years, President Donald Trump has waged a trade war against China. He has imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to protect American jobs. And the tensions surrounding the extradition of Meng Wanzhou from Huawei, recent Chinese tariffs on Canadian pork and canola, further illustrate this. So today's webinar will address key geoeconomic issues in U.S. Canada-China relations as Donald Trump prepares to leave the White House. And we are pleased to have three renowned speakers with extensive experience in this field with us today. Jonathan Manthorpe has worked for all Canada's major newspapers and news groups. He has been a foreign correspondent, war correspondent, and international affairs commentator for 40 years. He has undertaken special projects for a number of government and non-government agencies, and he has written many books about the issues that matter to us today. His most recent book is behind him right now. You can see the book. It's called Restoring Democracy in an Age of Populists and Pestilence, and the book was published in 2020. He is also the author of Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada. That other book was published in 2018. Good afternoon, Jonathan. Our second speaker is Rozlyn Engel. She is a professor of the practice at the United States Naval Academy and a non-resident scholar in the Geoeconomics and Strategy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She has spent nearly 2 decades at the nexus of economics, national security, and U.S. policy development. From October 2016 to August 2018, she was the senior career executive at the Treasury Department in charge of U.S. macroeconomic analysis. And she has a PhD in economics from Columbia University. Good afternoon, Rozlyn. And our third speaker is Louis Vachon. He is president and CEO of National Bank of Canada, a position he has held since June 2007. From 2005 to 2006, Louis was chairman of the board of National Bank Financial and of Natcan Investment Management. He had previously served as CEO of National Bank Financial. He holds a master's degree in international finance from Tufts Fletcher School, and he is a chartered financial analyst who, I can tell you, has maintained a strong influence in academic research in global affairs since the beginning of his career. Jonathan, Rozlyn, and Louis, thank you so much for being with us. Today's activity is a roundtable discussion. So I'm going to go around the table or the Zoom session twice and ask individual questions to the three of you, but do not hesitate to intervene at any time if you want to add to what your colleagues will say during the discussion. And after these two rounds are completed, we will reserve a few minutes for questions from the audience. Okay, so let's kick things off with the first round of questions. And I want to start with a question to Jonathan. This first question goes back to some of the things I said in my introduction. If we start from the premise that geoeconomics is now at the heart of the U.S. Canada-China relationship, could you describe to us the main pillars of China's geoeconomic strategy towards the U.S. and Canada and what it means for Washington and Ottawa?
Well, thank you, Frédérick, very much for the invitation to take part in this. And some of the issues that you raised about geoeconomic policies and initiatives I've dealt with in my new book, just up here. But I'm going to diverge a bit, I think, in talking about China's current view of the world. You know, Deng Xiaoping set the course for recent Beijing international behavior in 1990 in the dark period of diplomatic and trade isolation after the Tiananmen massacre. He set out what has become known as the 24-character strategy, which stated, quotes, observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time. Be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. Self-depreciation served the People's Republic of China well during its concentration on economic growth and the acquisition of modern technology in the 1990s and early 2000s. But that era began to end during the leadership of Hu Jintao, especially in 2008 and 2009, when the global economic crisis presented the PRC with a huge opportunity to win international credit for stopping the crisis getting worse. The era of maintaining a low profile was jettisoned conclusively when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, first as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and then as president the following year. Under Xi's leadership, the PRC has persistently and consistently pursued the aim of matching and overtaking the United States as the world's economic, military, and politically influential superpower. While success in economic competition has undoubtedly given the PRC the financial muscle to pursue that goal, Beijing has, in my view, in recent years, been just as assertive in displaying its military and diplomatic might. The PRC began a major modernization of the People's Liberation Army in 1990, after witnessing the US invasion of Iraq in the first Gulf War. The CCP leaders realized their massive, conscriptive, lightly armed peasant army was no longer a match for the high-tech forces of the US and its allies, as it had been in the Korean War. 30 years later, the PRC has a large and modern blue water navy, capable of deterring aggressors from its home waters and projecting power around the Indo-Pacific region, at least and probably further than that. The volunteer army has been reduced in size, but increased dramatically in its professionalism and modern armaments. Much investment has been put into the development of and deployment of a wide range of missiles for a multitude of purposes. We have seen that the PLA and its political masters know how to use the threat of their muscle to achieve their purposes. Most educational has been the occupation of the South China Sea and its transformation into a PRC lake by the construction of 7 islands. These were made into military outposts with runways for warplanes, port facilities for ships, radar arrays, and missile batteries. This is a piece of imperial expansion that cannot now be dislodged without a military intervention that would likely turn quickly into a regional war. It achieved over about 25 years by what is known as salami slicing. In a slow and methodical campaign, Beijing took small and incremental steps, none of which was aggressive in itself, enough to provoke pushback from the West or the other littoral states. At the same time, Beijing has been intensifying its rhetoric over its claim to own Taiwan. That rhetoric has been backed by more and more intrusive flights by military aircraft around the island. There are similar incursions by PRC aircraft and ships around Japan's Senkaku Islands, which Beijing also claims to own. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar scheme to finance the building of roads, railways, ports, and other infrastructure projects. The projection is sometimes called the New Silk Road, and its aim is to provide modern links for China with Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and even the Americas. This is designed to be not only a transportation network for commerce, but also, like the first Silk Road, a route for the passage of ideas and influence. In this case, Xi sees the BRI as describing a new map of the world with Beijing at its hub, from which it will influence international institutions and world affairs. In the last couple of years, we've seen one aspect of this with the rise of a generation of PRC diplomats known as wolf warriors. They get their name from a series of films about a fictional brigade of PLA's special forces, and are characterized by their rejection of traditional Asian courtesy and reticence. They are rude, aggressive, and uncompromising. Of additional concern for us in Canada are the activities of the United Front Work Department, Beijing's main political warfare operation, which President Xi has called his magic weapon. United Front operatives are at work here and in other target countries, such as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, the nations of Southeast Asia, the European Union, and elsewhere, recruiting for Beijing agents of influence in high places. United Front also directs other clandestine organizations to suborn and, where necessary, intimidate members of the 50 million strong diaspora of ethnic Chinese. This target, of course, includes 1.5 million Canadians. Beijing's disdain for international opinion and its confidence in disregarding criticism are clearly seen in its decision to effectively end the one country, two systems guarantees of civic freedoms in Hong Kong. It is the same with its refusal to cease its cultural genocide against Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims in Xinjiang and against Tibetans. To end, let me say that while I agree that geoeconomics has been the route by which the PRC has pushed itself to within sight of superpower status, I think we are now at a point where the military threat of the PLA and its drive for diplomatic ascendancy, built on the perception of American decline or relative decline, are even more significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So you told us about various tools that China is using right now to try to surpass the U.S. superpower. Let's turn to U.S. foreign policy. I want to ask a question to Rozlyn. Rozlyn, last September, you and your colleagues at Carnegie published a 90-page report entitled Making U.S. Foreign Policy Work Better for the Middle Class, in which the word China appears 86 times. 86 times. For comparison, the word Russia appears only 5 times in the same report, and of course, Canada less than that, 3 times only. So this shows how much China, and Jonathan told us why this is a concern. China is a geo-economic concern in Washington. What do you see as the key geo-economic issues in the relationship with China from a Washington point of view? And how does Canada fit into the equation?
So I would just say, first, China features very large in the report, really because China is very, very large. It's a large economy, a large country, very large strategic regional power. And for many countries, including the United States, a huge trade partner. So there's just a lot to talk about with China, and it's a multidimensional challenge, which is why you're seeing it throughout. And I think that Jonathan mentioned it, but we're really watching the evolution of a very complex world order, where we have the world's largest economy is still a developing one, which has a very ambitious kind of national growth agenda. It's also one that's only partly really committed fully to markets and to market-based commercial norms. And it has an authoritarian government, a one-party government, and it has, hegemonic ambitions, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a really complex world order that we're seeing evolve. And also on Jonathan's point, You know, a lot has changed over the last few decades, particularly since 2000, when China joined the WTO and its integration into the global economy accelerated. And over these past couple decades, particularly the last one, since 2010 and the financial crisis, we've had growing concerns and skepticism about China's real motivations, including some of its trade practices and some of its commercial norms and its willingness to really accept or adopt sort of Western norms in that respect. So I think where that leaves us is there's sort of this kind of full-throated support for internationalism I think is gone for a while. And I think we're seeing the emergence of some kind of adaptation to, the rise of China. And so any geoeconomic strategy that you see coming out of we can talk about the Trump administration, but the incoming Biden administration is really going to have to contend with the kind of this fraught nature of economic competition with China. And that's why you see so much of it covered in the report. So I think I would just say, I don't think we're going back to 2006. We're not going back to 2012. We're just a simple reset here is not possible. And the Biden administration has some big challenges on its hands. One is to try to put the China relationship on a somewhat better track than we were under the Trump administration, where you had this, kind of endless kind of trade war, which I think we'll probably end up talking about. And so no serious sort of strategic ends that were being, disciplinedly, in a very disciplined way messaged. And I think we also have some challenges in terms of trying to repair relations with American allies and partners, close partners, including, of course, Canada, so that we can rebuild trust in the U.S. On the geoeconomics, I think, I'm not sure how much of the audience knows what geoeconomics is, but I do think we're going to be seeing, because of some of the challenges that we have with China, pretty active use of that toolkit. So that's things like export controls, meaning the way in which the United States can actually restrict the export of particular technologies, usually so sensitive technologies. There might be some additional trade cases and confrontations in and around specific issues that are of a lot of concern to the United States. Talk about those in just 1 second. Possible use of sanctions will continue. Some issues in and around FDI reviews. The use of kind of targeted FDI by the US abroad, foreign aid. Those are all ways in which the US can actually take foreign economic policies, and begin to use them to shape sort of our relations abroad. So the issue areas, I'll just put a few up, and then I think you probably wanted to move on. But a couple of them will be IP theft and IP protections. Those have been a big fraught area for the United States with respect to China. State subsidies, the use of those state subsidies, particularly very soft subsidies on the credit side, meaning the state capitalism that the Chinese practice, and how do we address that? Currency manipulation, to the extent that that remains an issue. And then there are other things around kind of labor and environmental standards within trade and some of those practices. And finally, let me just touch on tech standards, which I don't know if Jonathan will talk about this or Louis, but I think it's interesting that China is talking about releasing something called China Standards 2035 to be released, I think, toward the end of this year, which is getting close. And it's something that they want to push through the Belt and Road Initiative, where they want to set tech standards. So for example, the Chinese investment in Turkmenistan recently was tied to the adoption of Chinese industrial standards. So the concern is that these tech standards will begin to be pushed out through BRI relations, and it'll be another form of kind of leverage that the Chinese are using to try to gain some advantages. And of course, the US is quite concerned about the development of those standards, trying to kind of, not control, but shape the digital economy of the future, upon which so much depends. So I think those are some of the areas where you might see some US policies evolving with respect to China.
Thank you, Rozlyn. We'll talk more about U.S. foreign policy during the second round of questions, but I want to turn to Louis and ask a question about Canada. As the American and Chinese superpowers engage in this geo-economic competition that we've seen for the last few years, what are the main implications for Canada, and what should Canada's geo-economic strategy be in the coming years?
So, merci, Frédérick, pour l'invitation. Thank you for the invitation. So, it's been pretty complex for Canada here, because Canada, as Jonathan has mentioned, we've had bilateral issues on geoeconomics with both China and the U.S. And on top of that, there's been some issue, particularly around Huawei, that we've been part of a ménage à trois, a geoeconomic ménage à trois. So it's been pretty complex. Now, the way I would describe geoeconomics today, at least for Canada, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. When you look at trade with the U.S., the stats are still very good. Trade with China will hit a new record this year. So we know the background, and there's been greater diplomatic and geoeconomic tension and political tension. At the same time, trade patterns continue to grow. So it's been, this dual relationship that we've seen over the last 12 to 24 months. Now, for Canada, what should be our geoeconomic strategy? The first one is to stabilize the relationship with the U.S. I mean, I think it was a bit of a trauma for everybody in Canada to have trade restrictions put on from the U.S. Citing national security reasons. No one had expected that, I can tell you that. So I think it is important for the Biden administration and for the Trudeau administration to really bring back more stability to U.S.-Canada relationships. I think Canada, anyways, is condemned to continue to diversify its trade flows. We're not present enough in emerging markets right now, excluding China. So we need to do that, and I think both government and businesses know that, but I think we need to make a greater effort on that front. In terms of China, specifically, I think we need to continue to trade with China. I think it's getting very complex. I echo Rozlyn's comments, and I think we'll address that on the second question. Between tech and financial flows and good and commodity flows, there's differentiation and fragmentation that's being introduced. I think the point of view of Canada should be to continue to trade and grow our trade practices with China, but just to remind the Chinese that when we had our issues and differences with the U.S., we did not back down, and we should not expect Canada to back down vis-a-vis China on some key issues. So we can trade with and be partners with large superpowers, but it doesn't mean that we roll over every time there's a difference on policy.
Jonathan, did you want to add something about Canada's geoeconomic strategy?
Yes, I mean, I think we'll get onto this a little later, but I think that one of the blessings of the last couple of years is that it has forced Canada to re-examine its policies and current practices in trade with not only China, but with Asia in general. I think that one of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years is that dealing with People's Republic of China is a very difficult business, and our trade imbalance with the PRC is sort of 2 to 1, I think, at least. I'd be interested to hear from Louis where the growth in trade has been with China. Whether I don't think that we have been exporting more to China. I think we may well have been importing more. So I don't know how much benefit there's been to Canada on this. But there's also, we've experienced sanctions in the last year or so as well, 2 years. And an interesting facet of that was that there was huge anxiety in Saskatchewan when China imposed sanctions against the importation of Canadian pork, and people said China is the largest importer of Canadian pork. Well, it is in weight, but I looked these figures up. In terms of value, we sell far more to Japan, and I think
higher value pork.
Yeah, I think there's a big lesson or illustration in that for us, that we really need to re-examine from the ground up our trade with Asia. And I think that we have, with the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the perfect agency with which to do that.
Jonathan, I wanna start the second round of questions with you. One of the key geoeconomic issues of this relationship between the three countries these days is the Meng Wanzhou. You referred to it, the Meng Wanzhou case and the detention of the two Michaels in China. I read an article you published a few months ago in which you said that this case may provide a chance to recast Canada-China relations. What did you mean by that, and what might be the outcome of this case in the next weeks, the next months? And do you think things could be different with Joe Biden in the White House?
Well, this follows on from what I was just saying to a degree. Let me just sort of try and bring people up to date with the whole Huawei affair and Meng Wanzhou. She was detained on December the 1st, 2018 by Canadian border agency officials at YVR at Vancouver Airport on an extradition request from the United States Department of Justice. Her case is still before the courts. It's probably, I think, even as we speak now, she's before the courts. She and her lawyers are arguing that well, there are several arguments. One is that her detention did not conform to the requirements of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that her rights were abused. And they're also arguing that this is a political detention or a political strike by the United States as part of its trade war with China and its concerns over Huawei, and not something which conforms to what would be illegal in Canada. That's all underway. There are talks in the last few, have been reports in the last few days that her lawyers and the Department of Justice are talking about a deal where she would admit guilt, make some sort of, pay some sort of penalty, and would then be allowed home, and that the whole thing would be forgotten. That might be nice for us, but because today is the second anniversary of the detention of the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Tovrig. Michael Tovrig is a former Canadian diplomat now working for the International Crisis Group. Michael Spavor is a Canadian businessman who's lived in China for several years and whose speciality is business links with North Korea. This has been a profound moment for Canadians because the detention of the two Michaels has, I think, shown many people that we share very few values with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. When their first instinct is to take hostages, when their first instinct is to protect a Red Princess and be prepared to dump the entire diplomatic relationship with Canada, that has given people a very harsh and hard view of the possibilities of our future relationship with the People's Republic of China. We have always had this sort of rather blithe and self-delusional notion that we have a special relationship with the PRC going back to Norman Bethune and Alvin Hamilton, the Conservative Agriculture Minister in 1960, who sold them wheat, lent them money to buy Canadian wheat during the Great Leap Forward famine. So I think that has forced Canada to say, well, look, wait a minute. If as soon as we have a diplomatic problem, the first thing they do is take hostages, what are we doing trading with these people? And I think it has prompted many Canadians at all levels to look at the other countries in Asia and say, well, look, we should really be focusing on those countries and those governments where we do share a raft of values, of civic values, and common views of international institutions and so forth, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore, and further afield in India and so forth, in other parts of Asia. So I think that this has really forced a rethink. I don't think anybody believes that we can just dump China. We can't. China, as Rozlyn and Louis have said, is too big. It is already probably the largest economy in the world, and that's going to stay the same. We can't ignore it. But I think that we should aim, and may well aim, I hope, for a far more simple and transactional relationship, and not confuse ourselves by thinking that somehow we are going to be able to influence Chinese policy and view of the world while this regime is in power. Anyway.
Before I go back to U.S. foreign policy, Louis, do you agree with what Jonathan just said? Did you want to add something about the Meng Wanzhou case?
No, I think, I think that the case, we know that, and I think we've seen the impact on public relations and public perception of China and Canada, and frankly on media perception of China over the last 12 to 18 months.
Rozlyn, since the beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump has decided to wage, as I said in my introduction, a trade war against China and sometimes against Canada because of the tariffs that Louis mentioned on aluminum and steel in Canada. And the goal was to encourage China and other countries to buy more American products or to abandon unfair trade practices towards American workers. I would like to hear you about this strategy. To what extent has this strategy worked and brought jobs to the American middle class? And you already told us a little bit about that, but what's going to change with Joe Biden? What's going to be his approach to bring back American jobs to key states for him as well? If you look at the electoral map on November 3rd, you see that Joe Biden was able to win key states in the region, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, where there's a sense of despair, economic decline. People want their jobs back. What's going to be the strategy?
Yeah, so I think on pure economic grounds, it's pretty easy to say that the trade wars failed. I mean, it's not even, right? If you look at just some basic statistics, so it's not improved the trade deficit, which has been a big focus of President Trump's. In fact, that trade deficit worsened through mid-2019. Those are the first, 3 years, 2 years. Then it kind of started a little bit of an upward trend, and then it's just collapsed since COVID. And if you look at manufactured goods, it's even worse, the performance. So there's nothing to point to in terms of, trade deficit or our trade imbalances, which were a big focus. It's not created net gains in trade either. I think the estimates are somewhere between the net loss of 175,000 to 300,000 US jobs. A big chunk of them manufacturing jobs. And people might be like, well, why would trade restrictions actually hurt US jobs? But if first there's foreign retaliation. So we put up tariffs and then other people, right, put up tariffs against US goods. So it hurts our exports. And then there are a lot of US manufacturers who rely on imported parts, imported goods as part of their supply chain, and that's been heavily disrupted. The steel tariffs, I think that's something probably Canadian friends are pretty aware of. And they raised prices for the steel using industries in the United States, like the auto industry, and they made them basically less competitive globally. So on the jobs front, the trade war has not helped U.S. workers. And then there's another level. We did a major tax reform at the end of 2017 to try to make the U.S. investment in corporate tax rates more competitive globally. But the trade war has essentially muted a lot of those effects because it's created a lot of uncertainty. There's been kind of an erratic and impulsive quality to a lot of the trade policy. And so U.S. corporates are not investing at the rate that people thought they might. So I think on that score too, the trade war has taken a toll. And then lastly, what you mentioned, which is that, the trade wars hurt our relations with some of our closest trade partners. It's really was pretty amazing. I know Canadians were shocked. I think a lot of Americans were shocked that we were, citing national security reasons for, major tariffs upon our closest trade partners. I do think you will see a shift, a very serious shift in the tone and in the messaging and in the approach with our allies out of the Biden administration. But I would say, like, on a deeper level, those are kind of some of the purely economic effects. But, this was bigger than that. It was actually a political strategy, right? And it had a lot of political appeal in the United States, and it still does, actually, which people need to appreciate that. And it has to do with broader economic anxieties that are at play in the United States and this kind of hollowing out of the middle class that's occurred over the last 2 decades. It's not all about trade. It's not all about globalization. Technical change and lots of things have contributed to it. But there's this sense that Washington has done a very poor job of managing the downside risks of globalization, and that we have not done enough to address the adjustment challenges for American communities and American workers. And there's also something of a perception, I think it's a little bit misplaced, but it's there, and President Trump, I think, really tapped into it, that the American people have borne a lot of the costs of maintaining a global system that's benefited just a few people, or a small group of people. So all of that has really contributed to this, to the trade war. And so the trade war wasn't really just about, trying to create some jobs in Ohio and Michigan. It was about tapping into a lot of these resentments and grievances. So I think you have to really understand all those trends to really understand President Trump's trade war. And I think that it's important to realize that, kind of what I was saying before, there's not going to be a simple reset, because all of the things that shaped the 2016 election are still very much there in the United States. And COVID is adding just another layer of complexity to all of this. So I think we still have to, the Biden administration will have to contend with these anxieties, these grievances, this insecurity in the large middle classes in the United States. But I will say, I think there's a little room for optimism, even though there is this general sense of kind of grievance and concern. What we heard, so the Carnegie report was based on hundreds of conversations that we had in Ohio, Colorado, and Nebraska with middle class families and households, but economic development experts and local universities. And what we heard was not really anti-trade. And if you look at national polls in the United States, if you ask it in a politically neutral way, right? So lots of things in the United States are just seen now through a very partisan lens. But if you ask it in a pretty neutral way, more than 3/4 of Americans actually think that global trade is associated with creating economic opportunity. So there's still a sense of trade is good, and we should be promoting trade, but it just needs to be, in the words of the Trump administration, I think you'll still hear this going forward, fair and balanced, whatever that means. But that's where I think American policy is kind of gone. So what is that going to mean exactly? I think there's going to be a sort of a deeper recognition that trade itself is an inherently redistributive process. And you don't jump into free trade agreements without addressing some of the broader distributional impacts of those trade agreements. Now, trade itself is probably not going to be a distribution policy. We're going to need better policies at home. So those would include things like, economic adjustment programs, longer term spending on sort of public infrastructure investment, education, those sorts of programs. I think you're going to see some stuff on sort of improving supply chain resilience in the United States. There's a section of the report that talks about the need for a national competitiveness strategy in the United States. So trying to kind of use all of the tools and powers that we have at the state, local, and federal level to help communities adapt to changing economy, which is also tech change, right? But also to this kind of more globalized world that we live in.
Before I ask one more question to Louis, I would like to ask Jonathan and Louis. Rozlyn was talking about the anxiety, the economic insecurity that you see in many parts of the U.S. and the Midwest in particular. Do you see that same kind of anxiety, despair, economic despair in Canada? And could there be an appetite at some point for a geoeconomic discourse that resembles that of Trump? Nationalism, economic nationalism, we should do better with trade deals and things like that. Do you see that kind of appetite in Canada on this side of the border or not?
Yeah, I think that disparity is something that has hit not only just Canada and the United States, but the whole of, if you like, the North Atlantic basin, Europe just as well. If you look at the rise of what we're calling populism, but probably more accurately called demagogy in Britain and in some of the countries of Europe, it arises out of the disparity that has grown since the end of the Cold War. So I think that this is a regional problem that is perhaps the most serious socio-economic problem that we as North Atlantic countries face at the moment. I really do. And I think that one of the things that COVID-19 has highlighted is this problem, certainly in the way that it has hit different segments of the economy, or different sectors of the economy, and different economic classes in radically different ways. So I think that this is a very, very serious problem. And I think that in some of our provincial elections here in Canada, we've seen parties come to power on the basis of appealing to the same kind of senses of insecurity that we've seen in the United States. Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, Saskatchewan, in particular, but I think that none of us are immune to this, because I think this problem of disparity, which has its birth really in the 1970s, is probably the biggest politico-economic problem that we in North Atlantic culture face at the moment.
Louis?
I think a lot of the issues, one of the key issues obviously is related to climate change. And I think the climate change has two challenges for Canada, one very domestic and one very international. Going back, I mean, you know, the different parts of the country have obviously very different views about carbon neutrality. Quebec is very favorable, but also very well positioned because of hydroelectric, capacity, and obviously it's the opposite in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that in itself, the transition to energy transition is going to be a political challenge in Canada. Globally, it's also a huge challenge because it did reduce our economic influence a little bit. We still are a large importer of oil and gas, but as we move to more carbon neutral, that has reduced our relative economic power, and anything that touches renewable energy is becoming much more a la mode and very attractive. And it is also, by the way, a huge, it's been beneficial for the U.S. It's a massive challenge for China because they're trying to also navigate that climate change. So one of the aspects of geoeconomics that will remain, has always been very important, but will remain important, is the issue of energy.
And I want to go back to you, Louis. You've been working in the banking and financial sectors for several decades now, as I said earlier. How does the geoeconomic competition between the U.S., China, and Canada affect your day-to-day work? What will be the main challenges in these sectors in the coming years?
So we see when we talk to our customers and when we see we have to operate in this world on a daily basis, we see, and I'm probably being simplistic here, but we see three different categories where the realities are different. The first one is anything to do with technology, information technology, technology transfer. That is the segment where the relationship between Canada, US, and China is getting the most complicated. So obviously, China has its own, internet system with search engine. US and its allies have their own. So we're already living in a world of splinternet. Anything touches technology with national security implications now, I think it is, there are a lot of restrictions on transfers and on control on research. So anything to do with artificial intelligence, automation, drone, robotics, quantum computing, already we're moving to a quite segregated world between a Chinese world and a more US and its allies world. So that the technology world is pretty much fragmented, and it's getting more fragmented. We see that with 5G. On goods, manufactured goods, on most manufactured goods and commodities like food and energy, it's, it's still a lot of trading going back and forth between the blocs. And yes, there will be occasional sanctions back and forth, but I think the trading will continue. Going back to your question earlier, Jonathan, since 2015, trade between Canada and China has gone up 33%. Exports have gone up 40% to China, and imports from China have gone up 19%. Now, it's still a deficit, but the trade deficit with China for Canada has not gotten worse. It's about stable on a proportional basis. So technology, a lot of restrictions, goods and commodities, trading, still, a lot of activity. The one I'm frankly surprised on has been how little impact has been on financial flows, so financial services industry. When we saw the U.S. block the acquisition of MoneyGram by Ant, I thought that was the beginning of more tensions between the two countries on financial flows, on the financial services industry. There's been talk, obviously, of accusing China of currency manipulation, but the renminbi has gone up. What we've seen in the last couple of years are Wall Street firms getting more involved, more present on the Chinese domestic market, and now being allowed to own 100% of their operations in China. So you would have thought that in a more, in greater tension, that it would have been more restrictions on financial flows. Now, I think it serves the two parties right now. I think it's a good case of interdependence in the sense that Wall Street wants to continue to grow. The pipes of the international financial system are controlled by the American firms, and I think they want to maintain that control. At the same time, China wants to progressively open its current account and allow more flows in and out, and eventually maybe become a reserve currency. So in that context, I think that collaboration is continuing. So for us on a day-to-day basis, our relationship, our trading securities and trade flows with China remains quite good. The future will depend on, for each of these different segments, how things evolve over time. So it makes for a quite complex global trading system, because you have, for technology, you have a lot of restrictions. For goods, you have much fewer restrictions. And financial flows, it's still going, it's in China is still the largest creditor to the U.S. So there's still an ongoing relationship. So going forward, I think, as I said, Canada needs to continue to diversify its trading flows and to have good relationships with, obviously, with the U.S. and be cognizant that China is a big trading partner. China, as Jonathan said, is already the largest global economy. If they're not, they will be. But we need to be, as Canadians, Canadian firms and Canadian governments, we need to be cognizant that China uses geoeconomic tools. And we should be aware of that and just be prepared.
Rozlyn, Jonathan, before we take questions from the audience, did you want to add something about this or about other issues we talked about during the first round of questions?
Not at the moment, Frédérick.
Okay, good. Rozlyn?
I think I'm good.
So we have a few more minutes for questions for the audience. We got a few questions. I'm going to start with one question that goes like this, and you can all answer the question. For China, all the issues, trade, criticism of human rights, diplomatic disagreements, etc., seem to be linked. And China responds on all fronts when one aspect is affected. Canada, on the other hand, and maybe the United States as well, seem to want to segment and deal with issues in isolation. Is this a good strategy? And if not, how can we do better?
I can try. I think there's a fairly fair criticism in there, which is that we have tried to keep things on parallel tracks. We had, in the United States, there was a strategic and economic dialogue with China, which actually the Trump administration discontinued. But there was a security track, there was an economic track. And sometimes they didn't really talk to each other. There was this sense of like, well, they're sort of separate things. We want to keep them separate. And the reason I think was, and I think this continues, which is, so there's a sense of the US wanting to move towards some form of national interests, right? Trying to better defend national interests, but doing it according to some set of principles. So principled nationalism, if you want to call it that. And that's going to involve trying to define the principles and the values within these different realms that we really care about and then defending them. Versus a broader kind of growth agenda that I think the Chinese follow, and a kind of whole of state, right, approach that the Chinese government will take. In the U.S., we have, much more distributed power. We also have a very advanced economy where we're trying to focus in on the issues that we actually think are the most important for us in our relationship with China. So I don't know if that helps answer the question, but I do think this, this idea that we need to kind of define the issues and then set the standards. I think that's where the U.S. has come down in terms of how it deals with some of these questions.
Louis, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried the same thing. We've tried to, we spent about $1 billion of Canadian taxpayers' money trying to get the Chinese Communist Party to understand about the rule of law and an independent judiciary, and got absolutely nowhere. In fact, the only result really was that a few Chinese lawyers who sort of thought the idea of the rule of law as we conceive it in the West and an independent judiciary were a good idea, that they've wound up in prison because they defended people that the Chinese Communist Party wanted to lock up, and subsequently got charged with various things like fraud and tax evasion and so forth. So no, I take the point of the question, and I think it's a very good one, and it really points to I suppose what one could call a clash of civilizations, and that very different ways of viewing the world, and we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party now getting much more assertive in putting forward its views on how not only its national interests but also international interests should be pursued. They're in the middle at the moment of a campaign in public media of trying to put forward and get accepted their view of what constitute the essence of human rights and civic rights. And as Rozlyn referred to earlier, they're setting out their own industrial standards and so forth, and creating their own institutions such as the Infrastructure Investment Bank, which are sort of rivals to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and so forth. And maybe our approach up to now has not worked, and we're going to have to think of other ways of doing things in dealing with China if we want to maintain some sort of semblance of a common existence. But I tend to agree that what we've been doing so far hasn't worked.
Louis?
Well, the question sounds like something you put in so that I can talk about the observatory on multidimensional conflicts. I mean, that was the origin of the observatory that we put together, Frédérick and I. It was the fact that there was clear isolation between national security issues and economic issues, and on top I would add cyber, and our perception that within government agencies and between governments and the private sector, there was a lack of alignment and coordination within Canadian society, and that we needed to do a better job in a context where governments are using these tools more and more, that Canada as a middle power, we're not looking to, we know who we are, but it's getting trickier as a middle power to navigate all these waters, and we need to get better organized and coordinated. It's one thing that I think I've witnessed through the financial crisis of 2008, and also what we saw this year with COVID, is Canada being a smaller country, we are capable of getting organized and coordinated very quickly in an extremely efficient manner. So having a response, a common policy that balances national security interest, economic interest, and values is not something that's impossible in Canada. We can do this, and I think we have to do this. We have no choice. You know, the world is evolving, the world is moving on, and we need to adapt very quickly.
Thank you, Louis. I didn't ask the question, but I guess it's someone from the center.
I'm sure.
We have another question. Does the nature of the Chinese political system give China an advantage over the United States and Canada in the geoeconomic competition between the three countries? And if so, how?
Up to a point, I would say. You know, since the death of communism and the introduction of state capitalism in the 1980s, the Chinese Communist Party no longer derives its political legitimacy from, if you like, the philosophical aspects of communism. It derives its political legitimacy from the GDP and from the aspirations of the Chinese people and its ability to meet those aspirations. You know, so far it's managed pretty well, but I think that if the China was to face a serious recession or worse, you would find the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party disappearing overnight. Now, having said that, you know, totalitarian states, and I think it's fair now to call China a totalitarian state at the moment, they can appear very strong and they can appear very much in command. But as we've seen, you know, for example, in the Arab Spring and even with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they're often very brittle. And you know, one tap in the wrong place and the whole sheet of glass falls in the street. I think that's less likely with China than with the Soviet Union or even the Arab states, because of the history of China and the absolute basic fear of chaos that exists in all levels of society in China. And that partly stems from the fact that there has never been a peaceful change of dynasty in China. There have been changes within dynasties, but never a peaceful change of dynasty. And so Chinese people tend to be stick with the status quo as long as possible because they fear what's going to happen next. So I suspect that the Chinese Communist Party is perhaps more secure in power than we might otherwise think, but it's still unpredictable.
Thank you. Yes, Rozlyn, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that. I do think, you know, the political system has advantages in certain respects, and it may have actually been very helpful at a certain point in the economic development of China when you needed a centralized power to basically, you know, capitalize development, really move people from rural areas into, you know, the coastal regions and really deploy labor. So I think it was quite helpful having that kind of centralized control. And I mean, they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for bringing, you know, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Yep. But I don't know going forward that it's a great system for stimulating what I call like intensive growth, meaning, you know, real productivity growth from innovation, you know, free information flows, the kind of creative human dynamic responses to challenges that are in front of you. So getting to that next level of economic development, which is, you know, deep human capital, entrepreneurship, that innovation culture, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's as well suited to doing that. And so it may have more challenges going forward.
Just backing up what Rozlyn said, and I'm sure Louis will have much more to say on this, but I think that you're absolutely right. And the challenge that they've faced really since the early 2000s has been to try to liberalize the market without liberalizing politics. And they've tried to thread a very narrow needle on that. And I'm sure Louis has a better feel of how successful they've been and how successful they can be in the future than I do.
I think generally I feel democratic systems are more adaptable long-term because they bring a better balance to different stakeholders. Societies are a complex mix of stakeholders, and the democratic system, as messy as it is, long-term brings a better balance of the stakeholders and a smoother transition. And going back to your point, Jonathan, I think a lot of people are puzzled as to the treatment of Jack Ma by the Chinese government, suspending because he criticized the regulatory, regime. And, if criticizing regulatory regime was a crime in Canada, I'd be a permanent citizen of full security, high security prison right now. So, so I think it is an example. So we'll see long term.
Well, see, since Xi Jinping came to power, from the figures I've seen, we've seen actually a decline in the role of private enterprise in the Chinese economy, and an increasingly a greater role either of state-controlled industries or of companies like Huawei, which are in effect under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And indeed, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there was a bill, a law passed by the National People's Congress, actually it's a bit more than that, probably 5 years ago, requiring all companies, private, foreign, all companies, to have Communist Party cells. And figures I saw from several reports that were done showed that the members of the Communist Party in those cells tended to rise to management positions within even private companies. And of course, this rule also applies to, quotes, private Chinese companies operating abroad. So the subterranean, if not the surface control of the Chinese Communist Party over corporate China is now even greater than it was in the early 2000s, from everything that I've seen.
Thank you. We have one more question, if I may. And the question is, I think it's interesting. We'll see where it goes. But if you have to guess, what do you think the relationship between China, the US, and Canada will look like in 25 years? Jonathan?
That's part of the subject of a book I'm working on, a new book.
Go ahead.
I think it's almost impossible to tell. I mean, I'm not a futurologist by instinct, and I think that if you look at the world in 25 years, or let's say 30 years, take it to 2050. The first thing you have to start looking at is population, and what is population distribution going to be at that time. China has gone through the sweet spot on its population. Its population is older and will continue to get older. We can see now what the population balance is going to be in China in 25, 30 years, and it is not conducive to economic expansion in the way it has been over the last little while. Where we are going to see economic expansion in the next 25, 30 years is going to be in India, which does have a sweet spot, and especially Africa. If you really want to know where to put your money these days, I would say put it in Africa, because that's where all the growth is going to be. I lived in Africa worked in Africa for quite a while, and so I keep an eye on it. And what is happening, the advances in Africa, I delight in seeing, because Africa has been through a rough few centuries, and I think if I was putting my money anywhere, I'd put it in Africa these days.
Louis, Rozlyn? Tough one, eh?
Well, I'm trying to do 3 and 5 year plans without making complete fool of myself. So 25 years is a long time. I think the demographics is usually important when you look. I agree with Jonathan. So we'll see. I mean, China will, the role of immigration in that context will be very important. And I think countries that have successful immigration policies in 25 years will be the winners. And Canada in this segment is starting first out of the gate. So we do have a very successful immigration policy. And for us, the challenge is to continue to stay on track. Unlike many other political jurisdictions so far, there's been relatively little debate about the efficiency and the desirability of that immigration policy. And long term, when you look at as a banker, we look at the critical segment for the population for wealth creation is a 25 to 54-year-old segment. And in Canada, we're growing that segment quite a bit faster than the US right now because we have more immigration on a relative basis. On a relative basis, before COVID, of course, we have 3 times as much immigration on a relative basis than the US, and we have a much higher percentage of university-educated immigrants coming to the country. So far, Canada is winning the immigration challenge, and I think the U.S. historically has won the immigration challenge. It's been one of the economic and demographic dynamism from the U.S. came from greatly from immigration. I think I'm optimistic that the U.S. will find its balance back on that particular segment. So North America 25 years from now looks pretty good, I think. Very good. And I think we're well equipped. So demographics is one. Climate change, I think we're well equipped to deal with climate change generally in North America. And lastly, it's the impact of technology, how technology is evolving. And again, yes, we have greater competition from China and Asia and other countries and Europe on technology. So be it. Great. I think that's net, as long as not a disproportionate amount of that research goes for military purposes. I think we're all winning on that particular point. But again, North America, Canada, and US is well positioned for navigating the technology revolution. So all in all, I think we're well positioned.
That's such a positive note to end on. I really don't know if I want to add anything except to say that, I do think the incoming administration really understands the value of U.S. alliances, the fact that there's been tremendous positive power in the number of alliances and close partners the U.S. has developed over the last 70 years. Does not want to squander it, wants to rebuild it. Canada is way up on that list. And so I highly agree that, the idea of a Pacific and the sense of, peaceful North America and North American basin is a huge asset, right, for the United States and for Canada. How China fits into that picture is partly, how much we expect of them and then how much they can come up to those expectations. So calibrating our expectations, right? What is appropriate to be pushing on and what areas do we have to let go? Trying to keep, as Jonathan said, chaos is not in our interest either in China. So trying to figure out how to, accommodate this peaceful rise and, defend our interests at the same time. But I do think, allies and alliances, international institutions, governance, coordination, cooperation, all of those things are going to be needed to do that. And I am hopeful that in the United States, we're moving more in that direction.
Jonathan, Rozlyn, Louis, on behalf of our center, our staff, our scholars, our students at the Raoul-Dandurand Chair, and on my own behalf, I want to thank you once again for accepting our invitation. It remains to be seen how this relationship between the 3 countries will unfold in the next months, years, 25 years. But there's no doubt that the audience that has come to hear you today is better equipped to understand the key geo-economic issues of the U.S.-China-Canada dance. Thank you so much again, and I hope to see you real soon.